15%. That's how many of the ballistic missiles Russia fired at Ukraine last month actually got shot down. Not 80, not 50, 15. Out of 195 ballistic missiles Russia launched in July, Ukrainian air defense intercepted 29. On August 5th, just days ago, Russia fired 24 ballistic missiles and 4 Zircon anti-ship missiles at Ukraine in a single attack. Ukraine intercepted 0 of them. Not some, not most. 0. Before we get into why, drop a comment and tell me what country you're watching this from. This channel's reach keeps surprising me, and I'd like to actually see where everyone's tuning in from. Now let's get into it. This is day 1626 of the war, and the story we're covering today isn't a Ukrainian success story. We've spent time on this channel and elsewhere documenting how badly Russia's navy, its refineries, and its submarine fleet have been degraded over the course of this war. Today's story runs the other direction. Ukraine's own air defense. The system standing between Russian missiles and Ukrainian cities is running out of the one thing it actually needs to function. And the numbers Ukraine's own defense ministry released this week make that impossible to spin any other way. Let's start with what Ukraine's defense ministry actually reported, because the specifics matter more than the headline number alone. In July, Russia launched 195 ballistic missiles at Ukraine, a mix of Iskander-M 48 in 6 decimeters, North Korean-supplied KN-23S, and Zircon variants. Ukrainian air defense intercepted 29 of them. A further 40 failed to reach their intended targets through other means: malfunctions, guidance failures, missiles that simply didn't hit what they were aimed at. That leaves somewhere north of 126 ballistic missiles that either struck their targets directly or landed near enough to Ukrainian cities, industrial sites, and civilian infrastructure to cause real damage. The ministry's own statement was direct about why. In July, Ukraine's air defense operated under conditions of a critical shortage of interceptor missiles to counter ballistic terror. Compare that to how Ukraine's air defense performed against everything else Russia threw at it the same month, because the gap is the whole story here. Of 265 cruise missiles, Kalibr, Iskander-K, and 101 variants, Ukraine intercepted 187, a rate above 70%. Of 8,653 attack drones detected, including Shahed, Gerbera, and Italmas types, Ukrainian forces shot down 5,143, just under 60%. Neither of those numbers is great on its own, and they're both down from where Ukraine's interception rate stood earlier this year. Ukraine reportedly intercepted almost 92% of drones during large-scale attacks back in May, meaning even the drone intercept rate has fallen by roughly a third in just 2 months. But the ballistic missile number sits in an entirely different category. 15% isn't a system under strain. It's a system that's effectively stopped functioning against the single most dangerous category of weapon Russia is using. That distinction matters because not all incoming threats are equally dangerous. And ballistic missiles are, by a wide margin, the hardest and most consequential ones to stop. A Shahed drone flies slow, low, and on a predictable path. Ukraine has built an entire layered defense specifically to shoot them down cheaply, using everything from mobile fire teams with machine guns to dedicated interceptor drones. A ballistic missile travels at multiple times the speed of sound on a trajectory that gives defenders only a few minutes of warning at most, and realistically requires a specific, expensive category of interceptor. Most critically, the Patriot system's PAC-3 MSA missile, to have any real chance of a successful intercept. There is no cheap, improvised answer to a ballistic missile the way there is to a slow-moving drone. You either have enough PAC-3 interceptors, or you don't, and right now Ukraine largely doesn't. President Volodymyr Zelensky has been unusually direct about exactly this shortage, in a way that's worth quoting because it goes beyond the ministry's own more clinical statement. He confirmed that Ukraine has secured agreements with the United States, the sole manufacturer of these specific interceptor systems, for a regular monthly supply, but stated plainly that even those scheduled deliveries fall short of what Ukraine actually needs to keep pace with Russia's current missile campaign. More specifically, he said Ukraine has begun receiving roughly 3 times fewer anti-ballistic missiles in 2026 than it was receiving in 2025, despite, in his telling, Ukraine's partners having the stocks available to provide more. That's not a production capacity problem on the manufacturing side. That's a distribution and prioritization problem, and Zelensky has been pushing it publicly, reportedly appealing directly to Poland and Germany for additional interceptors beyond what the United States has been supplying, in an attempt to close a gap Washington's own deliveries apparently aren't closing on their own. It's worth understanding why the PAC-3 MSA specifically has become this critical a bottleneck, because it explains why this shortage hit as hard and as suddenly as it did. According to reporting on the July numbers, Ukraine's stocks of PAC-3 MSA interceptors, the specific munition needed to intercept ballistic missiles with the Patriot system, effectively ran out on July 1st, not grew scarce, ran out. That's a hard cutoff, not a gradual decline, and it explains the specific pattern the Defense Ministry highlighted in its own July summary. During the overnight strike on July 6th, Ukrainian air defense intercepted 0 ballistic missiles at all. During the July 30th attack, only a single ballistic missile was shot down. Those aren't representative averages smoothed out over a full month. They're specific nights where Ukraine's ballistic missile defense was functionally absent because the interceptors needed to mount one simply weren't there. There's a pattern worth examining in how Russia has actually been using this window of vulnerability, because it doesn't look like random, indiscriminate bombardment. It looks like Russia has identified specific dates and specific windows to concentrate its heaviest ballistic missile use, presumably informed by its own intelligence picture of when Ukrainian interceptor stocks were running lowest. Ukraine's Air Force specifically flagged July 2nd, July 6th, and July 30th as the month's largest attacks. The July 6th strike is the one where Ukrainian air defense intercepted 0 ballistic missiles. Not a low number, 0. That's the kind of gap in coverage that either represents catastrophically bad luck on a single night or represents an adversary that has some visibility into exactly when a defender's most critical interceptor stock has been exhausted and is timing its heaviest strikes to exploit precisely that window. Whichever explanation is closer to the truth, the practical effect for people in Kyiv or Kharkiv or Odessa that specific night was the same. A ballistic missile attack landing on a city with functionally no ballistic missile defense operating against it. It's also worth understanding what these ballistic missiles are actually capable of, physically, when they do get through, because the danger here isn't abstract. Iskandarum and KN-23 missiles carry warheads in the range of several hundred kilograms of high explosive, capable of leveling a multi-story building or causing severe structural damage across an entire city block, depending on where they strike and what they hit. The Zircon variants Russia used in the August 5th attack are hypersonic anti-ship missiles being repurposed against land targets. Weapons originally designed to punch through modern naval defenses, now being aimed at civilian infrastructure, specifically because Ukraine has no reliable way to intercept them. These aren't the same category of threat as a Shahed drone, which typically carries a much smaller warhead and can often be shot down with relatively low-cost systems, including small arms fire from mobile teams in some cases. A ballistic missile that gets through doesn't produce a contained, survivable incident the way an intercepted or even a successfully evaded drone often does. It produces exactly the kind of mass casualty event we saw at that Kyiv train station platform on August 7th, not an abstract statistic sitting in a ministry report. On August 7th, 8 civilians were killed on a train station platform near Kyiv in what's been described as a terrifying Russian attack. Exactly the kind of soft, civilian target that becomes newly vulnerable when the specific interceptor system meant to stop an incoming ballistic missile simply isn't available in sufficient numbers. Smoke rose over Kyiv's Darnitsky district after a July 11th ballistic missile strike hit a roadway, setting a traffic light control cabinet on fire and damaging nearby buildings. A strike that, on a night with adequate interceptor stocks, might well have been one of the 29 that got shot down rather than one of the roughly 126 that didn't. There's also a broader energy infrastructure dimension to this shortage worth connecting to something else happening in parallel this month. Ukraine's state energy operator, Ukrenergo, reported that Russian strikes on Ukrainian energy infrastructure caused power outages across Donetsk, Dnipropetrovsk, Kherson, Sumy, and Kharkiv oblasts. Ukraine's own oil company, Ukernafta, reported Russian drones struck 7 of its facilities and 4 of its gas stations in a single overnight operation. And Naftogaz, Ukraine's national gas company, disclosed that Russian forces have struck its facilities 287 separate times so far in 2026 alone. More attacks in 7 months than in all of 2025 and the first 3 years of the full-scale war combined. That's worth sitting with directly. Whatever damage Ukraine has been inflicting on Russia's own energy infrastructure throughout this year, Russia has been running an even more intensive campaign against Ukraine's energy sector in return, and Ukraine's ability to intercept the ballistic missiles that make up a meaningful share of that campaign has collapsed at almost exactly the same moment. It's worth tracing the history of how Ukraine came to depend so heavily on the Patriot system in the first place, because that dependency didn't happen by accident, and understanding it explains why this specific shortage is so hard to solve quickly. Ukraine received its first Patriot batteries from Western partners in 2023, hailed at the time as a genuine breakthrough. The system that finally gave Ukraine a credible answer to Russian ballistic missiles after roughly a year of the war, where cities had essentially no defense against them beyond luck and dispersal. Since then, Patriot batteries and their associated PAC-3 MSE interceptors have become the backbone of Ukraine's entire ballistic missile defense posture, protecting Kyiv and other major population centers specifically because no other system in Ukraine's inventory, whether Soviet legacy or Western supplied, can reliably intercept a modern ballistic missile at all. That concentration of capability in a single system from a single manufacturer is precisely what makes a production or allocation shortfall this consequential. Ukraine doesn't have a backup system waiting in reserve if PAC-3 stocks run low. It has the Patriot system, or it has nothing, against this specific category of threat. The global demand picture for this exact interceptor is worth spending real time on too, because it reframes this from a story purely about Western reluctance to help Ukraine into a more complicated story about genuine, competing global scarcity. Lockheed Martin, the sole manufacturer of the PAC-3 MSE, has been ramping up production throughout this war. But missile production of this complexity doesn't scale the way, say, drone manufacturing does. It involves specialized components, a limited number of qualified suppliers, and a manufacturing process measured in months per unit rather than the days to weeks timeline Ukraine's own domestic drone industry has achieved for its unmanned systems. Meanwhile, demand for this same interceptor has grown sharply elsewhere in the world over exactly the same period. Israel's ongoing regional tensions, Taiwan's own deepening concerns about a potential Chinese ballistic missile threat, and Saudi Arabia's continued exposure to missile and drone attacks from Yemen have all driven up demand for Patriot systems and their interceptors among close American allies who are, in some cases, competing directly with Ukraine for the same finite production run. That's not a justification for Ukraine receiving fewer interceptors. Zelensky's own framing, that partners have stocks available but aren't providing them at the rate Ukraine needs, suggests this is at least partly an allocation and political prioritization problem rather than a pure production ceiling. But it's an important piece of context for understanding why simply producing more isn't a solution that can close this specific gap on any timeline that helps Ukraine this month, or likely this year. There's also a question worth asking about what happens if this specific shortage doesn't get resolved, because the trajectory matters as much as the current snapshot. If Ukraine continues receiving roughly a third of the anti-ballistic interceptors it was receiving in 2025, while Russia maintains or increases its current ballistic missile launch tempo, the mathematics here point toward exactly the kind of pattern we saw on August 5th, becoming more common rather than less. Nights where Ukrainian ballistic missile defense isn't degraded, but simply absent. That has implications well beyond any single city's air raid statistics. Ballistic missiles have increasingly been used throughout this war, not just against military and energy targets, but against exactly the kind of civilian infrastructure and population centers we saw hit at that Kyiv train station. Meaning a sustained gap in this specific defensive layer translates fairly directly into a sustained rise in civilian casualties, independent of anything happening on the ground war's front lines that we've covered in other reporting on this conflict. Because it would be easy to overstate the implications in either direction. It doesn't mean Ukraine's overall air defense has collapsed. The cruise missile and drone intercept rates, while down from earlier in the year, remain functional, and the layered system of mobile fire teams, electronic warfare units, and interceptor drones that handles the bulk of Russia's Shahed attacks continues operating at a meaningfully higher success rate than the ballistic missile layer specifically. What's actually happening is narrower and, in some ways, more troubling precisely because of that narrowness. Russia has identified the single hardest, most expensive, most supply-constrained category of Ukrainian air defense, and it's now able to exploit that specific gap with near impunity, because the interceptor Ukraine needs to close it comes from exactly one manufacturer in exactly one country, at a rate that country has apparently chosen not to prioritize at the level Ukraine says it actually needs. There's an interesting side story running in parallel here too, worth mentioning because it shows Ukraine actively searching for alternatives outside the traditional supply chain. Mikhailo Fedorov, Ukraine's digital transformation minister, has been in direct talks with Elon Musk about whether Starlink's satellite infrastructure could play some role in helping counter Russian ballistic missiles. Though Fedorov himself, in a recent interview, described the effort bluntly as a difficult task right now to achieve the outcome we need through this communication. That's a notably candid admission from a senior Ukrainian official about how unresolved this specific avenue remains. And it underscores just how few good options Ukraine currently has for closing this gap, outside of simply receiving more PAC-3 interceptors from the handful of countries that actually produce or stockpile them. It's worth asking, honestly, why this shortage emerged now, 4.5 years into a war where Western support for Ukraine's air defense has been a consistent talking point across nearly every NATO summit and bilateral meeting we've referenced throughout other coverage of this war. Part of the answer is straightforward manufacturing math. PAC-3 MSE interceptors are complex, expensive munitions produced at a limited rate even by Lockheed Martin's dedicated production lines, and demand for the same interceptor has grown globally. The same system protects Taiwan, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and multiple other American allies facing their own ballistic missile threats, all of whom are competing for a finite global production run. Part of the answer is almost certainly political prioritization within the United States' own weapons allocation process, which Zelensky's public comments about receiving 3 times fewer interceptors this year strongly suggest has shifted, whatever the underlying reasons for that shift actually are. And part of it is simply the brutal arithmetic of a war now well into its 5th year, where stockpiles built up over decades of peacetime production get drawn down far faster than any peacetime manufacturing base was ever designed to replace them. There's a public morale dimension worth folding into this picture too, because it complicates the story in a way that's genuinely surprising given everything we've just described. A poll conducted between July 20th and August 3rd, covering almost exactly the same window as this air defense shortage, found that the share of Ukrainians willing to endure the war for as long as necessary had actually risen to 61%, up from a low of 48% back in April of this year. That's a striking data point to sit alongside a collapsing ballistic missile intercept rate. Rather than eroding public resolve, this specific vulnerability appears to be coinciding with a hardening of it. The same poll found 60% of respondents opposed ceding the Donbas to Russia, with a similar share simultaneously supporting a frozen conflict paired with real security guarantees. A nuanced position that suggests Ukrainian public opinion isn't simply collapsing under pressure from months of intensified strikes, even as those strikes are getting through in higher numbers than at almost any earlier point in the war. Whatever conclusions Russian planners are drawing from Ukraine's air defense shortage, the population's will to fight is breaking, doesn't appear to be one the polling data actually supports. It's worth closing with what this specific vulnerability says about how wars like this one actually get shaped by supply chains most people never think about. Because it's easy to focus entirely on frontline maps and naval campaigns, while missing that a single manufacturer's production schedule, thousands of miles from any battlefield, can determine whether a missile lands on an empty field or a train station platform. Ukraine's naval drone industry succeeded specifically because it built something domestically, at a pace and cost structure it could control entirely on its own terms. Ballistic missile defense offers no equivalent path. It's the one major domain of this war where Ukraine's fate depends almost entirely on decisions being made inside a handful of foreign defense ministries and a single American manufacturer's production line. And right now, by Ukraine's own government's account, those decisions aren't keeping pace with what the battlefield actually requires. Step back and look at what this actually tells you about the state of this war right now, separate from any single month statistics. Every other front we've documented, Russia's navy, its refineries, its submarine fleet, has told a story of Ukraine finding asymmetric, often shockingly cheap solutions to problems that should have required conventional military parity to solve. This is the mirror image of that story. Ballistic missile defense doesn't have a cheap, improvised, asymmetric answer the way naval drone warfare did. It requires a specific, expensive, foreign-manufactured interceptor, supplied at a rate Ukraine doesn't control, against a threat Russia can manufacture and launch largely on its own domestic timeline. That's a vulnerability no amount of Ukrainian ingenuity or domestic drone production can fully paper over, because the physics and economics of intercepting a ballistic missile simply don't bend the same way naval or refinery warfare has bent throughout the rest of this conflict. None of that changes the broader trajectory we've traced elsewhere in this war. Russia's own economy and military remain under sustained, serious pressure across nearly every domain we've covered. But it's a genuine reminder that Ukraine's position in this war isn't one of uncomplicated strength across every single front simultaneously. Air defense, and specifically ballistic missile defense, is the clearest exception to that broader pattern right now. A domain where the numbers, released directly by Ukraine's own defense ministry rather than by any outside analyst, show a system that spent at least part of last month essentially unable to stop the single most dangerous category of weapon aimed at its own cities. Stay informed. Not every front in this war is going Ukraine's way at the same time, and this month's numbers are a stark reminder of exactly which one currently isn't. That's this week's analysis report. See you in the next one.